This is Kate Evans, educational developer based in the Centre for Innovation in Education at the University of Liverpool, and you're listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Academy's Developing Practice podcast. In this episode, we chat with Kate about neurodivergence and the importance of understanding this in relation to supporting learners. We hope you enjoy.
Kate, we're really pleased to be talking to you today. We're delighted to speak to you about neurodiversity and the importance of understanding this in relation to supporting learners, whether those learners are students or staff. But before we get started, we love to get to know our guests a little bit. So could you tell us a bit about your background and how you've arrived at the role you're in today?
Yeah, sure. And thank you very much for having me, by the way. So every single educational developer that you will ever speak to will have a different path to how they came to be doing the job they're doing. Mine has been partly by accident and partly by design. So I've taught and trained students and staff in HE in many different guises over the years. The focus of my current work here as an education developer is the curriculum. And within that focus, I've got a particular interest in equality, diversity and inclusion. And so I'm the EDI lead for the Centre for Innovation in Education. I came to focus on EDI because I have anyway a very strong sense of social justice. And I got a particular interest in disability when at the age of 15, so I was 15, my dad suddenly became disabled, so no warning. He lost his sight within a fortnight. Oh, wow. And that's been permanent. And that just completely changed the way that I looked at the world as I saw him encounter kind of barrier after barrier and have to show immense strength and courage and kind of finding a new identity and a new working life and a new way around absolutely everything. So that's kind of what put me on that path, if you like. And it's just continued in the work that I do when I encounter students with disabilities or staff members with disabilities. And then I had my own disability, which hit unexpectedly at the age of 33. Again, an illness was not expected. That leaves me with a few challenges. And that all of that kind of combines to give me a different lens to look at everything with. So when I arrived at Liverpool, I was really pleased that there are colleagues here who've got additional knowledge and the same passion that I have. And for once I wasn't kind of the lone voice in the room going, excuse me, has anybody thought about this? And the work we're currently doing in my centre as well to do with inclusivity in the curriculum, I'm really pleased to be involved in.
Fantastic. So is your work around EDI allowing all students to access the curriculum, or is it in terms of ensuring representation in terms of EDI within the curriculum?
It's sort of both.
Right.
It's actually very blurry and a little bit confusing. So when you talk about EDI in the curriculum, you're looking at it from two very different angles. One of them is the student experience. Are they experiencing an inclusive curriculum? And the other is their own understanding of EDI that they will then need to take into the professional world, and that goes into the content of the curriculum. So it's you're looking at content, you're looking at the way the curriculum is designed, and trying to make sure that both of those things align really well so that the students get that rounded experience. And that's connected at the minute also, as some of you will be familiar with the fact that the QAA benchmark statements, subject benchmark statements, are bringing in EDI as content. They're also bringing in decolonisation, which knocks onto EDI. And then many of this is where I forget things, PSRBs, which I did write down what that stands for. It's the regulatory bodies, professional, statutory and regulatory bodies. So if, for example, you're training to be an architect, there will be regulations that you have to follow. EDI is coming in those as well, some of those leading ahead of the QAA. So as educators, when we look at the curriculum, we need to be really mindful that this is not just a choice that people have now. This is actually increasingly becoming a very valued and valuable part of the curriculum.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I guess that's the aim, isn't it? It becomes the norm. Obviously, EDI encompasses a huge amount of different things. So but today we're looking at neurodiversity in particular in relation to supporting learning and development. So I think for the sake of the listeners, I think it'd be a good thing to ask, what do we actually mean by neurodiversity in this instance?
That, again, is a really useful question, and I thank you for it. So the words we use are really important, particularly when we're looking at equality, because they often reflect hidden values that underpin them. Neurodiversity is a classic example of something that is really well-intentioned that's gone a little bit awry. So neurodiversity, the idea is we're all diverse, we're all included. Mm-hmm. Every single one of us on the planet will have a brain that works slightly differently from everybody else. And that's fabulous, and we should be really pleased and proud and happy as individuals. However, it has been taken to mean people who have a difference. So you'll hear some people saying, this individual is neurodiverse. You may even have individuals saying, I am neurodiverse. You choose how you define yourself. But what you mean with neurodiverse is that you as an individual. We're not talking about an actual difference that is recognised. Mm-hmm. When we talk about neurodiversity in terms of recognising difference, we talk about neurodivergence. That's a recognised difference in the way that the brain works. So when you're thinking about things such as conditions like dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia, all of those conditions which are expressions of the brain working in slightly a different way to what we regard as neurotypical, which is how most people perceive the world, that is a neurodivergent brain. So neurodivergence versus neurotypical. Okay. Language is always slippery with EDI. And I'm saying this, but I'm putting this in great big brackets, which says, please always ask the individual, because everyone has their own identity and will tell you how they like to be referred to. But in terms of language and disability, it's complicated anyway. You have, for a long time, it was disabled people, and then people started saying, disabled people saying, I do not recognise myself as a disabled person. I am being disabled by society. Mm-hmm. I'm a person with a disability. Yeah. And you get the person first language, and that took off, and that was very strong, not that long ago. And now you're getting a switch back again to people saying, well, I'm not somebody with this. My identity is that I am a disabled person. And in the autistic community, they're very sort of strongly tending towards, I am an autistic person. Somebody explained to me not that long ago, they said, you don't talk about it as like, I'm a person with a hint of autism. They said, I'm an autistic person. That is how I view the world. This is my reality, and that's how I choose to define myself. And that for me was really interesting. Because it was a view I hadn't heard before. I was still in the person first zone. So when we look at neurodivergence, neurodiversity, neurotypical, the easiest, safest at the moment way to talk about it is neurodivergent versus neurotypical. Okay. And then neurotypical is what's generally cultural norms expected. Neurodivergence is the added extra.
I think it's really interesting what you've said. I would like your phrase about language as slippery, because it really is. And I think that's can be part of the problem, can't it, with these sort of things, where people are a little bit fearful of tripping over themselves sometimes with this. So I like your advice as well about, just ask the person. It makes a lot of, it's good common sense, that. So what issues do you see for neurodivergent staff and students in terms of accessing development and learning?
So I think the fundamental thing that we have to remember with this is that education has mostly been designed by neurotypical people for neurotypical people, with no questioning of the norms that underpin it. Neurodivergence is often invisible. So we talk about invisible disability. I personally, slippery language, much prefer invisible disability to hidden disability, because hidden implies an act of hiding. And some people may be hiding, but many of us are just invisible. So invisible disability. You may have staff and students who prefer not to declare their disability. That's absolutely their right, and they have really valid concerns or valid reasons for choosing that. Many may be undiagnosed or unaware that they are neurodivergent, or may simply not ever be invited to let staff know they're neurodivergent. So, you have to anticipate disability as an educator. And it's up to us as individuals to educate ourselves about what that looks like and what we can do to make things easier for people who do have neurodivergence. So when you're looking at accessing development and learning, these invisible barriers are very visible to the people they're affecting, but often completely invisible to those of us who don't have those same eyes to look at them with. So it can be really very basic, like if you have a slow processing speed for information, which is something that I'm struggling with. If you don't get materials in advance, you will really struggle to keep up in class. It's just too much information coming far too quickly. You can't process one thing. Here's the next thing. Here's the next thing. You very quickly become lost, disorientated. And if you've gone through a school system that didn't support you, or you've got that kind of stuff you're carrying with you, negative experiences you're carrying with you, this just reinforces everything. And so that's a really easy one to get around, because all you need to do is send materials in advance. And then anyone who's going to be in your classroom, and when I say classroom, that means any environment in which teaching and learning happens, they can look at that in advance. They have that option to do that. Or they can sit in the class and know that afterwards they can go back over it and it will be there. And lecture capture has been huge, actually, in that regard as well. Other things that can be really complex. So we know that, so anecdotally, we know that disabled students sometimes avoid particular types of assessment. And that will actually limit their curriculum, because they might be really interested in this subject, but hey, it's got a presentation and I can't do that and I will get a low mark, so I'm not taking that. So putting more flexibility into the way that we assess at university can really open up modules to everybody, because otherwise it is going to cause a disadvantage. Likewise, if you struggle with essays and that's the way that's assessed, maybe you will choose not to do that particular piece of learning, to minimise what you know is going to affect your mark. So that this is the reality. These are the barriers that we don't think about, but they are very real for people who have that experience. We also have the fact, I think, that success in HE relies very heavily on having good organisational skills, having good communication skills. And we typically have these very fixed formats of assessment. If you are not kind of providing enough support for people with poor organisational skills, they will struggle. That's their disability causing them to struggle. That's the neurodivergence, and that's the barrier there. Many people are excellent when they're planning for their students, and they'll have a fantastic VLE and they'll have everything put in place and they'll be really clear. They'll have session plans at the start of any session that they're running. These things are fabulous and make a really huge difference. So it's just about kind of thinking, because when they're not there, it can really be challenging. So we've got also things such as neurotypical ideas about group work, the importance of group work, and also the importance of being able to give a live presentation. And these are things that are put in as their key employability skills. And that's not untrue. They are important for some types of employment. However, if we put them in as things that will potentially be a barrier to you achieving at university, that's limiting people's options. So if we were saying to an autistic student, I want you to do a live presentation, this is how we're going to assess this course, and that student knows that they will really struggle to present live, I would suggest, if they know that about themselves, that's going to affect their career choice potentially anyway. So if you give them the option to pre-record something where they have control over the environment in which they're putting this together and the end product before they share it with anybody, that's a way that you really support them to succeed. And the argument about this being important for their career is valid, but you can succeed in careers by doing things your own way. I mean, this is we have it from the other side. We have this idea. We have this legal concept of reasonable adjustments. We will put an adjustment in place to allow people to succeed. That applies at work as well. So if they're having a reasonable adjustment here, they can carry that through. So I think it just makes far more sense if we are a bit more questioning about what we expect. And so not expecting every single student to succeed at group work. I was in a session, Matt, with you not that long ago, and we were talking about how students might work with some content in a session, I think. Yeah. And I said to you that we are increasingly thinking about offering students a choice of whether and when I say students, that could be the staff that I'm working with, whether people want to do a piece of work on their own and then feedback, or whether people want to work in pairs.
Right.
Because if you're saying, right, now we're doing some pair work, I'd like you look at this thing and come up with some suggestions, and then we'll all feedback. We've taught like this for years. It's a very effective way of getting a class to actively learn something. However, it's not an inclusive way of doing it, because for some people, that's going to go absolutely against everything they're comfortable with, possibly against everything that they are able to do successfully, and publicly we're putting them in this position where they haven't got an out unless they leave.
Yeah. So it's the shock of that instruction coming through when they didn't know it was going to come through as well. But that can completely throw an individual, I can well imagine.
Yeah, and again, we hear, and I don't want to suggest that all autistic students have the same way of thinking, but we hear from the autistic community, it's really important to have everything known in advance and no surprises in the classroom, because that's very unsettling, sometimes can be quite a threatening environment to suddenly find yourself in. So some of it's about signposting, but some of it's also about choice and giving students choice of how they choose to engage in the teaching and learning. All we want is to support them to learn. So why not just give them a bit more choice in how they successfully can do that?
Fantastic.
Yeah. When we had that conversation, that immediately changed my practice. I was delivering a session to a group of staff on CV writing and application form writing. I think it was a couple of weeks after that. And I immediately went to my pre notes and my sort of the materials that I sent out beforehand, and said, here's the materials. This is what will be happening on the day. This is how many breakout rooms I'll be having, because it was an online session. And these are the length of the breakout rooms. And just so if anybody just thought, you know what, that's not for me, then that was fine. They could make that choice, just like you've said. That's changed my practice immediately.
That's really lovely to hear. I completely forgot to talk about any online anything in what we've talked about so far. But I personally have a dread of Zoom rooms. I'll do it. I'll go in. I have the facilitation skills to be able to cope with doing it, but I hate it. And if all that is wanted is for me to do some thinking about content before feeding back, don't send me into a room with other people. Give me an option to go in at all. Or, I think when we did our inclusive curriculum bake-off, which was day 2 of our conference last year, we had it was hybrid, so some people were online and some were in the room with us. And we did, I think we asked them in advance if they would prefer their own Zoom room all by themselves, so that we could have done that. They could have just gone in there and then they wouldn't have felt pushed around anywhere else. In fact, nobody chose that. That's great. It's just about the choice.
Yeah, that's it.
That's fantastic. I love what you're saying about choice. Something that I've done recently is I run the Learning and Teaching Fellowships for the university, and I design them to suit myself, which involve filling in an application form and writing a beautiful piece of narrative around practice, and it worked really, really well for me. But what I was finding was only a few people would apply, because I guess that form of assessment, even though it's involving staff, worked only for a certain subset of people. So what I've done recently is I've given people options. So either they can write the application form, or they can put together a pre-recorded PowerPoint where they speak over the top, or that they meet with me and do a kind of professional dialogue. And I've found that giving people that choice, as you're saying, in terms of how we assess them, has really opened up those fellowships to a whole range of different academics from and professional services across the university. And it's been really effective, because I think sometimes we design for ourselves, don't we, and what works for us, but we actually need to think about what you're saying in terms of neurodiversity and ensuring that everyone can access what you're doing. That's really helpful.
That sounds fantastic, by the way. So
good, thanks. Yeah. From my experience, neurodivergence is often seen as a disability, particularly in the education system, and then if students move into higher education as well, rather than a potential asset. And I was just wondering, how can we help change that whole narrative around this in our sector, do you think?
So that's a really tough question. So we obviously have the Equality Act. We have the anticipatory duty towards disabled students to provide them with an accessible education. That's the legislative framework that we're operating in. As far as neurodivergence is concerned, we get conflicting guidance, which really isn't helping. So we've had, in recent months, from the Office for Students this point about written English and the fact that universities must must be able to demonstrate that the written English is at an appropriate level to be awarding degrees, or they may lose their degree awarding powers. That is in direct opposition to stuff that's been coming through previously, which has been saying, we need to be enabling students to succeed and not putting so much emphasis on the written word. And obviously we have reasonable adjustments, and you can put reasonable adjustments in place. And I'm sure if there are academics listening to this, some of you will have your head in your hands about what I'm saying. I'm not going to apologise. This is my view. It's a personal view. It's not representative of the university. But I really do think that, criticality and content are the things that show where you're up to with your learning, and whether or not it's fluently written. I think that needs to flex a little bit, but we're not allowed to, because this guidance has come through, and that's where we currently are. I think the guidance reinforces the deficit model that you're talking about, because it makes it makes it an extra job for people who are working with students who have a reasonable adjustment. They have to mark those differently, so that the reasonable adjustment is is being met and the student is being supported to succeed. Absolutely approving of that. So when we look at trying to change this deficit view, yes, I'm going back on myself, which I do all the time. But that was the question, wasn't it? So it was about how we start viewing neurodivergence as something we value and we really want to embrace, rather than a deficit model. Part of this is in our day-to-day. I mean, it's like what you've both just said about how you've made changes to your own practice. If everyone makes little changes based on what they've currently learned, that already starts changing the culture. We start thinking about being welcoming. And then those invisible barriers, perhaps they start disappearing, and that changes the way that education feels for every single individual in it. So if we aim to normalise neurodivergency and we aim to expect it and welcome it, I think that's huge. When you look at kind of disability campaigning, for years they've been saying, nothing about us without us. It's their massive slogan. I think that's immense. I think it's really important. And I think it absolutely applies to any minoritised situation, actually, not just to do with disability. That we shouldn't ever be kind of expecting some to fix something for others. It's something that we do together, and we negotiate that change together, and we're open about what's needed and what we're doing and how we're going to move it forwards. So that requires mechanisms to make that work appropriately, and I don't think that there are many universities that have those kind of mechanisms in place. We've got fantastic support for disabled students at this university, brilliant team doing absolutely wonderful work, but in terms of changing the way that everybody thinks, that's still too quiet, if you like. That needs to be amplified. That voice needs to be heard a lot more. No, what I think is also really nice here is that we do, as a university, we celebrate things like World Autism Awareness Day or Neurodiversity. I can't remember if it's a day or a week. But these things are becoming more publicly celebrated within our institution, certainly. And I think, that that's coming nationally. Perhaps slower than we would like, but it's coming. And I think every time you invite people into something and share positive stuff with them, that changes the way that people think. And sometimes that comes by hearing negative experiences. If people are really brave and they're happy to share, the situation they've gone through, and then we learn from that as well. So I think I also think that the EDI benchmarks are going to make a big difference. Because that, again, it's all about normalising this. So there stops being either some extra burdensome, troublesome thing, or something that's different and other, and it just becomes a normal way that we think about things. Like you hear kind of like this idea of 360 feedback. Well, if you're looking at your curriculum in that rounded way, then you're looking at everybody and everybody's needs, and you're trying to make sure that your curriculum is built to support everybody's needs.
Yeah. While you're talking then, one of the things that's running through my mind is, say I've got a student who's gone through the school system with an educational healthcare plan, say it's a neurodivergent student, gets to university, has supported through university, maybe he or she's had a great experience, the assessments have been authentic for them, they've had a good experience, and then they get into an employment situation. One of the things I'm thinking when you're talking there is, society isn't really set up, is it? So as soon as they go through that process and they're supported, they get into an employment situation, they might go to an interview, and the first thing they're asked to do is present, or even just the interview process in itself, where you're asked questions on the spot and you might not be allowed to see them beforehand. All these things are immediate barriers to employment. And I'm not asking you to provide me all the answers, but how do we prepare people for that type of situation, or where their jobs just might be, they might be inhibitive for them to progress in them, because the institutions or the companies just might not be set up in a way to support people?
So again, that's a huge question.
It is, yeah.
And again, a very good question. So, I mean, I have some personal experience of this, in that I worked full-time before I became disabled. Then I got ill, didn't know what was wrong with me, managed to kind of limp on with work until we geographically relocated. And then eventually I got a diagnosis, but I hadn't realised that it had cognitive issues as well. It's my situation is to do with my balance, and so I'd assumed it was physical stuff, not mental stuff. And then I was having a career break from my family anyway, and then when I was trying to go back to work, exactly what you're talking about was what I was hitting. The interview process. I could do the form, took me forever, total nightmare, but I could do the form, but then it would be, here's a task for you to do unseen, or here's a presentation for you to do, and then unseen questions. And my particular brain thing is that if somebody asks me a question, a lot of the time, if kind of in greetings card shops or Waterstones or whatever, you've got those card holders that are a circle that you can gently spin round so you can see like one and then move it on to the next one. Imagine that that's everything you know, and somebody asks you something and the answer's one of the cards, but they spin. By having asked you that, you've just got this rotational thing and your brain just panics and nothing comes out. I had a ridiculous number of interviews. I was good at getting interviews, could not get past them. And it wasn't until I was open in an interview about the fact that I had some cognitive challenges that I got my first job again. And that just came because they asked me something and I blanked. And I thought, no, I'm not going to look incompetent. I'm tired of that happening. And I just said, I've got some problems with my memory, so I haven't got the detail for you, but the gist would be blah, blah, blah. And I got that job. And their first question, a lovely person who offered me that job, was, how can we best support you? And Brilliant. That's kind of where that went. And then coming here, I declared on my application form, and I said, I have a disability, and I asked whether I could have the questions in advance, right. Which I got, and I asked if I could have longer for the task, because it was a live task to come up with a presentation, which I also got, and those two things put me on a level playing field, and then I got the job. So my situation is obviously very different because I'm considerably older. If we're looking at people who've been through school on an EHC plan, that plan doesn't help them at university. It drops. It's like a cliff. Yeah. So they come here and they have to start re-navigating, and they may or may not be very well equipped to do that. Going out into the world, there is support. I mean, we obviously have the support that we have from our career service here, which is fantastic, and they are aware if this is an issue, they will have support in place for that. There are then other particular organisations that will support you if you have a disability and you're looking for work. But it's not easy. And then when you get to work, you may have to ask for reasonable adjustments. And in law, you can ask, and some employers will be happy about that, and some will really not be happy about that. Yeah. So it's a cultural shift that I think the present generation just won't tolerate this as a rubbish situation, and they're just going to be really vocal about it, and I think change will come from there. Good.
And I guess some of it is reframing it entirely, as you were saying earlier, of actually seeing neurodivergence as an asset.
Yes, yeah.
And not a deficit. And I think your example that you've really kindly shared with us is really helpful, because you are fantastic at your job. Mm-hmm. And yes, some tweaks needed to be made for the interview for you to evidence that, but you're a massive asset to that job, far more than anyone else who hasn't got the experience that you've got. So it's about removing some of those barriers so that people who aren't neurodivergent can actually fly at what they're doing. I've got friends who are who would openly say that they're neurodivergent. They're fantastic at their jobs. Mm. I couldn't do their jobs. Because of the way that their brain is wired. It makes them brilliant at what they do. And that's seeing them as an asset in that role, I guess, rather than us always defaulting to the deficit model of, how are they going to cope in the workplace? Well, maybe they'll do better than the rest of us in the workplace as long as we don't put barriers in their place.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that reminds me of something I was going to say actually about the curriculum again. So we have in CIE a group work contract. So if you're doing group work with students and you want your groups to be off to a good start with hopefully working in harmony and building on each other's strengths, exactly what you just said, Alex, then the group work contract can really help you with that. It's a conversation starter between groups. So each group sits down and they talk about things they're really good at, things they perhaps are not so strong at, and perhaps somebody else in the group will take on that role. And it offers that exchange of who is excellent at what and how together we all combine to kind of do really well. It needs a little bit of planning. It needs to be done within a classroom environment, I would say. But it's a first step towards recognising different skills and different values and being glad that they all combine.
Yeah. So talking of the curriculum, I guess universal design for learning comes into this. And you've given us plenty of suggestions already, actually. You know, we're just talking about things around interviews and so forth. But what suggestions would you have for developers or lecturers to ensure their development activity or teaching is neurodivergent friendly by default?
So I think one of the main things actually is there's a lot of talk around safe spaces at the moment.
Right.
We hear it kind of used a lot. It's into a saturation point and all this kind of stuff. But essentially, in creating a safe space, you are trying to create a space where people will feel open to be themselves, open to express their views and supported to express their views. It's important to be clear here that I, as an individual, cannot make a safe space for you, Matt, because only you can decide if the space I've created feels safe to you. But I think as academics, we can absolutely attempt that and say, I would hope that as a group, we set an intention for kindness. That phrase comes from my colleague Joanna Cheetham, who is lovely and very, very good at all this stuff. So if we set an intention for kindness in the dialogue that we have with each other, we accept slippery language, we accept that, we may use terms that are perhaps expressing values we hadn't realised were not values that are very appropriate, and that we will help each other learn that things are not being said with a negative intent. And also that as somebody in charge of that space, which you are, if it's your classroom, that you're ready and prepared to handle anything that comes. That can be really scary. It's like opening Pandora's box, isn't it? You ask a question, you've got no idea what perceptions are coming back. But I was speaking to somebody recently who was saying that there was an example where somebody that had shared a view in a classroom environment about trans experience that was directly relevant to what was being discussed. And it was shared, I think, in a poll, and it was ignored. The member of staff didn't pick up on the fact that this thing had been shared. And that student who had shared it, bravely, anonymously, but really bravely, I think we have to be really careful that we are supportive in these safe spaces of everything that comes. And so if we don't know, and if something comes up and you think, oh my word, I've got no idea, how do I handle that? I think it's appropriate just to say, oh, it's really good to see that we have somebody talking about the trans experience in this situation. And I'd like to thank whoever put that up. And then you've just acknowledged it and you've made it clear and you've made everybody aware that this is here, and so the same is true of as I say, any minoritised individual.
Yeah. What do you think about the learning resources, the materials that are put out by lecturers or developers? Is there anything that you think we could do which changes the default of those materials that make them a bit more friendly for neurodivergent people?
So we've already talked quite a lot, I think, about things like, for example, the session plan, which I think is huge, and sending them out in advance. In terms of making them as accessible as possible, some people will groan. I'm going to say the word. We're talking here about digital accessibility. That's really important. You know, if you have created a document and you've followed the guidance for digital accessibility, that means it's optimally created if somebody wants to listen to it rather than read it. If you've used all the headings rather than bolding your headings or italicizing your headings and so on, a screen reader will be able to read that out loud, or a software package will be able to read, and they can get the structure of a document without having to go in and start wading through pages and pages.
Yeah, it's good advice. I see so many documents that don't have that.
Yeah.
And it always surprises me these days, like, you just use the style in Word, just hit the style button, it's there.
I think it's just familiarity, isn't it? And the fact that everyone is so busy. And digital accessibility is like, heart sink, another thing we're supposed to spend time trying to figure out. Yeah. It's little changes that make a massive difference. The other one, it may be less important now, but there was a lot of conversation on one of the lists I'm part of last week about the background colour for slides, and the fact that, you know, white on... So black type on white background is really difficult for quite a lot of people, and it's easier if you just take that contrast down a little bit by using a slightly coloured background or a dark grey instead of a black font. However, there were disagreements about that as well in terms of what was best practice, and nobody came up with a solution on that list to what was current best practice. But students, if they're looking themselves, will have, I have on mine, I've got a tint. I just always have a slightly orangey screen, and that for me is absolutely perfect.
Right.
I know we're going to mention resources potentially a bit later on, but I am just going to sign people, if you're listening, we have on the CIE website a really good video about inclusive presentations, and that covers everything you would need to know about digital accessibility, really. I mean, it is just great. So.
One of the things that I was involved with a few years back was an e-learning offshoot from local government, and we created about 15 hours worth of e-learning aimed at the children's workforce, which could be anyone from a social worker to a lollipop lady or man. And we created all this e-learning, and we tried to find the most friendly font possible. And we picked Comic Sans, and it was the worst mistake we could have made. Now, yes, it's lovely to read, but the complaints we got about Comic Sans, and because it's like childlike, people were saying, you know, so you know, we're working with children, we're not the children, with some of the complaints we got. So it can be a bit of a minefield, can't it? Because Comic Sans is a good font to use for readability.
It is. I think it's recommended by the dyslexia
organisation. Yeah, but when you put it somewhere, it's universally hated. So you see.
Oh, I absolutely hate it. Also,
I do.
Well, we spent a lot of money and a lot of time changing every single piece of font to Century Gothic as a result of that feedback. And it's something that will stay with me forever, I think, because I was the one involved in it and doing it. I think the feedback that you got was really interesting, this idea that it's infantilizing. I think that comes from really negative experiences, do you know what I mean? And people thinking, treat me like a grown-up. Yeah. Even though it is a recommended font. I personally, as I said, I really hate it. I like Courier or Arial that are just really plain, and they're the sans serif as well, so they don't have the curly bits that cause issues for people who have dyslexia. So yes, one of the things, Matt, that you mentioned is universal design for learning. That's a fantastic basis on which to build inclusion. Really, really good. So for anyone who's not familiar with universal design for learning, or UDL, it comes from architecture. The idea that you would design a building that would be accessible. So where we have ramps instead of steps, that's an example of universal design. When we look at learning, it's about designing out barriers, which obviously we've been talking a little bit about already. So if you're looking at UDL in a little bit more detail, it's about offering choice. That's the heart of UDL. So they talk about multiple means of engagement, which is where you give your students the choice and autonomy about how they participate. We already talked, this idea of whether people work by themselves or whether they work with others, for example. And then also preparing students in advance, we talked about that. And also things like making sure students know they can step out if they need to step out. There can be anxiety about what will people think if I step out, but if you've said at the start, if anybody just needs a couple of minutes, just
go ahead. That you've set the ground rule there that kind of invites everybody to be comfortable in your setting. When you look at learning materials, it's about, it says multiple means of representation. Representation here is the way that the materials are represented, like text or images or whatever. It's about a mix. If you aim for a mix, that will be really helpful because that supports all different strengths of the students that you are teaching. It's also something that Blackboard Ally can really help with. So Blackboard Ally, if you're not familiar with this, can display certain content in different ways, but students mostly won't know that Blackboard Ally can do this. So if you say somewhere in your VLE, or you say in the classroom, that if you would rather hear than read, Blackboard Ally will be able to support that for you. It's just those little things where you're just underpinning the choice and giving the agency to the students themselves. Sending materials around in advance, we also talked about. And Matt, your lovely example about any questions you're going to ask in class, send those around too, because those are the things that cognitively challenge people in a very short, constrained time frame and can really cause problems. And finally, multiple means of action and expression. So whether you're talking about diverse ways to contribute in class, which might be that some people will contribute verbally, but are you also offering polls so that people can have a choice if they're not comfortable speaking out in public? And also that you consider neurodivergence when you plan anything. A classic example of this is when you see like a live poll that's a quiz, and there are I'm sorry, I'm going to make people groan again, but there are some that kind of flash pretty colours and timers and all this kind of stuff, and the fastest answer wins. That's terrible, because as a neurodivergent person, you will never win.
Right.
If you have a processing issue, you will never win. You will never be quick enough to read, think, find the right bit to press, and pass it in. So that's just reinforcing your own potential feelings of deficit. So, just kind of thinking a little bit about that. And then assessment, we've talked about choice of format. So really important again.
Kate, that's been fantastic and so interesting. So thank you so much. This podcast is called the Developing Practice Podcast, and we love to finish each recording with 3 or 4 take-home tips that our listeners can reflect on in terms of their own personal practice. So if you could give us a few tips, what would they be?
Okay, so EDI is a journey. It's not something that you can kind of quickly get your head around, and it changes all the time. Practice recommendations change all the time. So one of my top tips, I think, would be, if you can, please try and block some regular time for an EDI catch-up in your diary. So maybe you do it before you start a semester, maybe you do it after you finish a semester, but a little bit of dedicated time for you to catch yourself up on all things EDI and look at your own practice and think, what can I do better next time, or what unexpectedly worked really well, and what can share with colleagues, pass the information on. So that would be one thing. Because it can be quite overwhelming to suddenly get all these new ideas and suddenly maybe realise that there are quite a few things that you wish you had been doing differently and you want to change. It might help just to narrow it down a bit and look for 3 small steps. So quick wins that you can do right now, perhaps based on something you've heard today or something else that you've encountered recently. Write them down and see if you can implement them. That's a start. Just get started. And finally, I think if you, in your context, can provide an opportunity for all students, but also including neurodivergent students, to let you know how you can best support them, and then share what you learn along your journey, and don't expect your neurodivergent students to educate other people. I think that trying to get that dialogue going and learn, and you make this upward spiral, like Kolb's learning cycle and all of that. It starts with asking the question, offering that space for students to come back to you, and then building on what the experience has been.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time today, Kate. It's been great to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, I really appreciated what Kate said about how education is usually designed by neurotypical people for neurotypical people, with no questioning of the norms that underpin that. We need to be aware of this and instead ensure that we design learning experiences for all learners, not the few, by removing the barriers that Kate spoke about.
Yeah, Kate spoke about how we need to normalise the conversation, and I really appreciated that. The EDI benchmarks will help us with this. And so instead of designing learning for all learners being a troublesome burden, which is an add-on, it will become a normal way of designing learning experiences that supports everyone's needs. And for me, I think that's what this is all about, is thinking about how we can do that. If you want to take your thinking further, we've added some resources to the website on a specific podcast reading list, which you can access at liverpool.ac.uk/the-academy/podcast. And these include some of the excellent resources that Kate and the Centre for Innovation in Education have designed, including a brilliant video about inclusive practice that Kate's colleague Joanna Cheetham has created. Also, we love to know what you think about each episode, so please do tweet us at LiveUniAcademy, and you can also find us at eLearnerMatt or at Alexandra_Owen on Twitter.
And we're really grateful for those who have either taken the time to rate or review our show in your podcast provider's app. So if you haven't done so already, please do take the time to review our show, or even better, just simply share the episode with friends and colleagues on your social media. Bye for now.